When I first started teaching at Ridgeway High, it was the middle of the school year. That awkward point where everyone already has their rhythm, and you're just the stranger trying to blend in. The desks had names carved into them from years of restless hands. The walls smelled faintly of old chalk and teenage sweat. And the flickering light above my desk buzzed like a trapped insect. The first few weeks went smoothly enough, though I kept feeling like I was missing something. Like there was an undercurrent running through that classroom I couldn't see. It wasn't until I got called to the administration office one Thursday afternoon that I realized how little I actually knew about the kids I was teaching. The principal, a woman with a permanent squint that made her look perpetually suspicious, handed me a thin manila folder. "You'll need to handle this one," she said. "It's standard procedure. He hasn't attended class more than 3 times this term. You'll have to inform him he's being expelled." She said it like it was routine, like it was nothing. The student's name was John. When I called him into the room, he walked in quietly. A tall, wiry boy, maybe 16. His shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled past his elbows, and there was something distant in the way he looked at me, like his mind was a few seconds behind his body. He didn't argue, didn't curse, didn't even look surprised. I remember fumbling through the words. "This isn't personal, John, it's just the attendance policy." I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked near the end. He smiled, just faintly. "You don't have to explain, ma'am. I know the rules." Something about the way he said rules made me uneasy. His politeness wasn't the normal teenage kind. It was too measured, and it looked practiced, like he'd rehearsed it for moments just like this. I told him I felt like I didn't have the full picture. He shrugged. "You probably don't. Nobody ever does." That's when he stood up, thanked me for being gentle about it, and walked straight out into the hallway. For a moment, I thought that was it. But then, just before he reached the door, he stopped, turned, and stared at one of the boys in the front row. Nathan, the loud one who always had something to say about everyone. John's face didn't change. Not anger, not fear, just stillness. Then he stepped forward and punched Nathan so hard I heard the crack of bone before the scream. The room erupted, kids shouting, chairs scraping. I stumbled back as John reached into his pocket and pulled out something, a small black can. Pepper spray filled the air like mist. My throat burned. Kids were coughing, crying. Through the haze, I saw John walk calmly toward the exit and disappear down the hall. I wasn't even prepared for what happened next, because the next day I was called into the office again, only this time there was no file, just silence. The police had been notified. The boy he hit had a broken nose, but John, he never came back to school, never answered calls. No one seemed to know where he lived, and the address in his file led to an empty lot on the east side of town. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I told myself it was just guilt, that I'd done what I had to do, but on Monday, when I was sorting through some of the student reports I'd inherited mid-year, I found a small, unlabeled folder at the bottom of the drawer. It had been shoved so far back I almost missed it. Inside were photocopied notes from the school counselor, notes about John. Apparently, he'd been bullied, not just teased, tormented, locked in closets, mocked during lunch, his locker filled with garbage. No one had done anything. No teacher had reported it. The counselor's last note said, "Student appears withdrawn, non-communicative, exhibits symptoms of anxiety and possible trauma. Recommend observation." That note was dated 11 months ago. Nobody had followed up. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of that canister hissing echoed in my ears every time I closed my eyes. At one point, I thought I heard it again, a faint metallic click near my window, followed by the slow rasp of air escaping. And when I got up to check, there was nothing there. 2 days later, I came into class to find a folded piece of paper sitting on my desk. No one admitted to putting it there. It wasn't in an envelope, just a single sheet, folded once. Inside, written in small, careful handwriting, "Thank you for trying to understand." No signature, but I recognized the pen strokes. It gets scarier. One evening, I stayed late to grade papers. It was around 7 p.m. The hallways were dark except for the emergency lights, humming faintly. My classroom door was half open, the light from the hallway cutting a strip across the floor. I remember hearing something, the soft squeak of shoes against linoleum, then a faint clatter, like someone dropped a pencil. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I got up, heart thudding, and walked toward the door. The hallway stretched out empty, lockers closed, shadows still. Then, right as I reached for the handle to shut the door, I noticed it, a faint mist near the end of the hall, drifting like breath in cold air. And that smell, that sharp chemical sting, pepper spray. I didn't wait to find out more. I locked the classroom and left through the back exit, heart racing. The next morning when I came in, there was a smudge of red dust near the door. Not blood, not paint, something in between. It smeared when I touched it, staining my fingertips like rust. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence. The letter, the smell, the sounds. But part of me can't shake the feeling that John didn't disappear, that he just found another way to exist. Somewhere between this world and whatever's waiting for kids like him, the ones we fail to see until it's too late. Sometimes, when the room goes quiet between classes, I catch myself glancing toward the door, half expecting to see him standing there, polite as ever, holding out that same calm smile. And if I ever do, I hope he forgives me. I was barely 2 months into teaching at Pine Hollow Elementary, still getting used to the odd hum the building made whenever the heat kicked on. It was a Friday, the kind when the clouds hang low enough to touch the top of the playground swings, and the kids were wound up in that pre-storm way children often are. That afternoon was sharing circle, which they loved. They lined up their backpacks against the wall as we sat on the rug, 12 7-year-olds forming a crooked circle. Melanie came clutching a plastic doll with a rubbery face and tangled yellow hair. It was the kind that could cry if you pressed its stomach, and she carried it around all week like it was her own child. We hadn't even finished settling when a thin electronic wail rose behind her back. I smiled. "Melanie, sweetheart, let's turn your doll off for now, okay?" She nodded, and the crying stopped. We moved on. One boy stood up proudly with a homemade cardboard shield. Another girl showed a jar of marbles she'd inherited from her grandmother. The circle was peaceful until that doll shrieked again. Not cried, shrieked. A glitchy, metallic howl that didn't sound like any toy marketed for children. "Melanie," I said gently, "please don't press it again. It's distracting the class." She muttered, "I'm not pressing it." Before I could respond, I noticed what she was doing. She wasn't holding the doll like a child. She had it gripped by the hair and was shaking it so violently the head thumped against her wrist. Then, before I could even process it, she punched it in the face, hard, her small knuckles thudding against the hollow plastic. "Melanie," I rushed over. No, sweetheart, we don't hit toys. Or babies." She didn't look up. She kept shaking it. "Make it hush.
It keeps waking up." Before I could take the doll, another voice cut across the room. A boy in the circle, staring blankly at the wall, spoke in a low monotone. "Punch its face till it stops." My scalp prickled. The tone wasn't joking. It was flat, icy, like someone reading instructions from a page I couldn't see. Let's use our words, not our fists," I said. I went to pick up the doll only for it to let out another corrupted scream, its speaker rasping. When I touched its chest, I realized the switch on its back was already in the off position. That's when the hairs on my arms rose. The switch shouldn't have been off. Before I could dwell on it, we moved on and Melanie eventually shared her doll. The moment passed, the kids moved on, but something in that room felt wrong, like an unseen draft passing between us. I thought that would be the strangest part of my day. I was wrong. After dismissal, I stayed behind to file a few behavior notes, mainly about the doll incident. That's when I noticed another notebook on a desk across the room, a spiral-bound composition book I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I froze. The pages were covered, every line edge to edge, with frantic handwriting, not words, not sentences, just the same phrase repeated dozens of times. "It watches from the corner." Some pages had it written so hard the pencil tore straight through. Others had drawings, crude, shadowy figures with long fingers, or circles with scribbled-out faces. Every few pages had something else. "Quiet them down. Shake them till they hush. Punch baby face." I shut the notebook immediately. A chill flickered up my spine. It was the exact cadence the boy had used earlier, that hollow, emotionless tone. I called the number listed in the file, wanting to notify the parents. A woman answered, her voice thick like she'd just woken up from a deep sleep. When I explained the notebook and my concerns, she sighed and said, "Oh, he expresses himself that way. It's normal for him." "It's not exactly normal," I insisted. Some of the drawings were disturbing. "I'm worried something might be, you shouldn't try to control what he sees," she said abruptly. "What he sees?" "He's sensitive, much more than your other students. His father sees things too, and I do sometimes when the moon is full." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I stayed quiet. Then she said, voice lowering, "You should be careful, miss. Very careful. There are people who watch over him, people who don't appreciate interference, people who work from far away." "Who exactly do you mean?" I forced out. She hesitated, then whispered, "Those whose presence you feel but cannot see." Then she hung up. I sat there, the empty classroom cold around me, my heart thudding. Outside, the hallway lights buzzed. The doll, long forgotten on my desk, let out a soft, glitching whine, its dead batteries wheezing one last breath. It was supposed to be off. I started teaching at Oak Ridge Elementary in late September, about 2 months after finding out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but it felt right, or at least it had, before everything that happened. Oak Ridge was one of those small, rural schools where every classroom had the faint smell of crayons and dust, where the janitor still mopped with bleach water that left streaks under the fluorescent lights. I taught 4th grade, 22 kids, each with their quirks and sugar highs and after-lunch meltdowns. Nothing I couldn't handle. I'd been doing this for nearly 7 years. I remember the morning I told the class. I was about 4 months along, still hiding it under sweaters, but the kids were sharp. They'd noticed I sat down more often, that I stopped drinking coffee. When I finally told them, in that bright teacher voice meant to keep things cheerful, they all clapped and asked a million questions. Was it a boy or girl? Would I name it after them? Would I still come to field day? It was sweet in that chaotic way kids can be. All except one. Evan. He was quiet at first.
One of those kids who always seemed half somewhere else. Polite, but distant. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was strange little things that didn't quite fit. Once, when we were doing creative writing, he'd drawn a picture of a baby floating in a jar and said, "It's not born yet, but it can still see." I thought it was just imagination, dark but harmless. I even noted it in his file, highly creative, introspective. But then, small things started piling up. The first time was during art period. The kids were sculpting with modeling clay, making animals and goofy monsters. I walked around the room praising their work until I stopped beside Evan's desk. He wasn't sculpting an animal. He'd made a tiny figure, a woman lying flat with something small pressed against her stomach. When he noticed me looking, he crushed it in his hands, grinding it into the table. He looked up, expressionless, and said, "She told me to do that." I told myself it was just a phase, a cry for attention. But then it happened again the following week. This is where it starts getting worse. He'd begun to linger after class. Everyone else would run for the buses, but Evan would hang back, standing by the window, watching the playground. Once, as I was locking up, he said softly, "I think your baby wants to play with me." I didn't even know what to say. I laughed, awkwardly, and told him the baby wasn't ready for that yet. He smiled, just a tiny curl of his lips, and said, "It told me it's lonely." After that, I couldn't shake it. Every day felt a little heavier. I started noticing how he'd angle his desk to face my stomach, and how his eyes followed me when I moved. There was something too deliberate about him. The other kids joked, ran, whispered. Evan just watched. Then one day, there was an incident on the playground. 2 students came in crying. One had a small cut on his arm. I was called to the office to fill out a report, and there was Evan, sitting in the chair outside the principal's office, his knees swinging, his face calm. When I asked what happened, he turned his head slowly toward me, looked me dead in the eyes, and said in that flat little voice children use when they're repeating something rehearsed, "He made me do it." I asked who he meant, but he just smiled faintly and whispered, "The baby." I didn't sleep that night. By November, my anxiety was getting worse. I started taking my lunch breaks in the staff room instead of in the classroom. Even then, I'd catch glimpses of him through the small window in the door, standing there like he was waiting for something. Then came the day with the scissors. We were working on a craft project, paper snowflakes for the hallway display. I'd just finished helping a student when I heard that snipping sound. Too fast, too close. I turned and Evan was standing by my desk, a pair of scissors in his hand, opening and closing them slowly. He looked up at me and whispered, "When can I meet it?" My throat dried. I took the scissors from him, set them down, and sent him to the principal's office. I didn't even finish the day. My hands were shaking too badly to hold the chalk. I filed an incident report. The principal said they'd talk to his parents. "Evan's been through some things," they told me. "His mother passed away last year, and his father's not around much." That was supposed to make me feel better, but it only made me feel worse. Because that night, when I was closing up my classroom, I found something on my desk. A drawing. It was a baby. Just a circle, really, with stick arms. Inside what looked like a dark shape. Underneath, in a child's uneven writing, "She says she's cold." I took leave the following week. This is where it gets darker. I told myself it was stress, hormones, anything but fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something, or thought he did. Sometimes at night I'd wake up convinced someone had been standing by my bed. My husband would find me crying, unable to explain why. When I came back the next school year, the principal told me Evan had transferred. His family had moved suddenly. No forwarding address. Part of me felt relief. The other, something closer to guilt. Like maybe I'd failed him somehow.